Hey guys, I'm Mono. Over the past year and a half, I've done almost 80 videos on Hella Loose, from guides to match commentary, highlight reels, everything. So it might be kind of surprising that despite having a video for basically every single aspect of the game, I've never actually done a full review for it. So now that the game is finally out of early access and coming to consoles on October 5th, which is just a few weeks from now, I thought I'd finally do a review of Hella Loose for anyone that wants some more detailed information on what the game is actually like, how it plays, how it runs, and so on. As always, I'm using the PC version to do this. Open beta for PS5 is coming in a few days, so I might do a video focusing on the performance aspect of that when that happens. But, I don't know. Before I start, I just want to say this is a very deep game with a lot of different mechanics, so there's no possible way that I could give you a complete picture of every single thing in just a short video, so I'll just focus on the most important stuff. Alright, let's get started. Hella Loose is a semi-realistic 50v50 multiplayer shooter set in World War II. Hella Loose's gameplay lies somewhere in between the arcadiness of games like Battlefield and Call of Duty, and the milsim devotion of games like Postscriptum or Squad. In my opinion, it strikes a perfect balance between those two genres, offering you the best of both worlds. It's a Battlefield game where you die in one shot, and it's also a milsim where you aren't bogged down by a stamina bar when running around. You can shoot out of a sprint without having your weapon sway all over the place like in other more realistic games. And it's also a very fast-paced game. It takes very little time to get to the action due to how spawn points work in the game, so it's not at all similar to games like Squad in that regard, where there's a lot more running around. It reminds me most of Forgotten Hope, which was a mod for Battlefield 1942 and Battlefield 2 that stripped down the arcadiness of those games in favor of a more hardcore, realistic approach without going too far into that direction. In fact, when I interviewed the lead developer in an interview that you can watch right here, he mentioned Forgotten Hope as one of the influences in designing Hella Loose. However, he did mention the biggest influence being Company of Heroes, which is an RTS game. Perhaps the most unique aspect to Hella Loose's gameplay is the reliance on map control and player-built spawn points. There are only 3 default spawn points in every single map, and those are located at the very edge of the map and act as your team's headquarters or starting point. This is where vehicles will spawn and where you have your static artillery pieces. Every other spawn point you see on the map was built by another player, so unlike games like Battlefield where capping a sector will automatically reward your team with a spawn point, that is something the commander or squad leaders must do manually in Hella Loose. As a result, you get a much more dynamic and diverse gameplay experience where map control is king and player agency greatly affects the team's defensive or offensive capabilities. That said, you can also have extremely frustrating experiences if your team ignores this fundamental aspect of the game because you end up having nowhere to spawn and end up running all the time. I mentioned the other big focus is map control. This isn't a game where you just focus on fighting over the objective area and move in a line from one point to the next. Some people think it is, and they end up having an absolutely miserable experience because of it, and lose games without understanding or being able to learn why. In Hella Loose, securing a position means not only controlling the objective, but also its surrounding area. How much of this surrounding area? Well, that depends on what the area is like. Are there any good buildings to hide in? Are there any elevated positions that allow you to control terrain and stuff like that? The other team will try and flank you, get around you, and gain control of those key areas that provide the best avenues of attack into your position. That means you have to actually spread out and fight over parts of the map that might be 200, 400 or 600 meters away from the quote-unquote actual position you need to fight over. Let me be super clear on this. No other game does this better than Hella Loose. At least none that I've played. Map control is the driving force behind this game, and map control is represented by the layout of a team's spawn points. No spawn points means no map control. I often see players complain that they get shot all the time from seemingly everywhere. Well, that's what happens when your team focuses on the dark circles on the map instead of engaging with the map as a whole. When you do that, your spawns will be reduced to only those inside the actual point, and you will get surrounded without even realizing it, because the other function that these spawn points have is to act as radar. When an enemy is close, they will light up in red, which is crucial to understanding where the enemy is or isn't on the map. Before leaving this topic, let me say there are two types of spawn points: garrisons and outposts. Garrisons are for the entire team, while OPs are squad specific. Having plenty of both is the key to success. Apart from these two details, gameplay is largely similar to other shooters. There's 6 players per squad, a squad leader and 5 infantrymen that can choose from a variety of different roles like engineer, AT, assault, or support. Each class has a different loadout, and while some classes like the engineer have special roles like being able to build stuff, or the support being able to provide supplies for you to build stuff, most of the other roles are just different types of infantry. There's also tank squads and recon squads. Tanks can only be driven by armor squads, and recon squads are the only ones that can build their OPs, which are their squad specific spawn points, anywhere on the map. Gunplay, I think, is incredible. Every weapon feels great, and they are all very effective and deadly, given most will kill you in a single shot, and all of them are extremely accurate. Depending on the map, combat encounters will range from tight city streets to vast open fields, making weapon choice extremely important. Semi-auto rifles are well suited for every single role and are my usual go-to, but SMGs or assault rifles like the STG-44 are just fantastic in close quarters. There's many iconic weapons in the game, like the MP40, the G43, the PPSH, the SVT, and of course the Kar98 and the Garand, but more weapons will be added to the game, from shotguns to flamethrowers. So you shouldn't worry about getting bored with the gunplay, because it's tremendously satisfying and more weapons will come. Tanks are in a weird spot at the time of this review because we just got the first phase of a bigger armor overhaul that should be coming relatively soon, but as of now, damage models are quite simple, so stuff like properly angling your tank to deflect shots isn't actually a thing, unfortunately. That might change in the future, but right now tank engagements are quite simple and rely almost entirely on getting the jump on an enemy tank. It's not very rewarding or complex, that is for sure, but tanks are also incredibly powerful when it comes to dealing with infantry, and I would be lying if I didn't mention I have an absolute blast playing tanks in more armor-oriented maps. Speaking of which, let's talk map design. Maps are perhaps the most realistic aspect of the game, since they are modeled after their real-life locations. Roads and buildings are placed according to their real-life counterparts, using real, actual World War II era pictures as reference. There's obviously some tweaks for gameplay's sake, but as a result, you have these very convincing real-life locations that don't feel like they were designed exclusively for a game. Each map has 15 objective points, but every time you play, you only get 5 of them, completely at random, meaning the same map can play completely differently based on which objectives out of those 15 you actually get. Nothing changes physically in those maps though, which means those 10 spots that didn't get picked as objectives for the current match are still important locations. It's not like those buildings disappear when they are not active. They still offer tactical advantages, they are still relevant, they are still in play, and ignoring them usually means losing the match. This ties in with what I mentioned earlier about the importance of map control and spawn points. Each match starts with both teams spawning at their respective headquarters and making a dash for the middle objective, which is neutral at the start of the game. There's an offensive mode where one team controls the entire map at the start and the other team has to push them back, but I won't focus on that for the sake of simplicity. After one team secures the middle point, which usually happens in the first 5 or 10 minutes of the game, the real battle begins. By then, one team is already winning, since victories are decided by who controls the most objectives. Matches can last anywhere from half an hour for a complete steamroll to an hour and a half for a really well-balanced encounter. There's a good variety of different maps available. To name a few of them, there's currently Omaha Beach, Carentan, Kursk, Stalingrad, Foy, Purple Heart Lane, and many others. I think currently there's a decent variety of different map styles, and of course more maps will come in the future. So that's most of the gameplay stuff out of the way. Obviously, your experience will vary greatly depending on the people you play with, because as I mentioned earlier, this is a game that really heavily relies on squad leaders and commanders doing what they're supposed to do, which is building spawn points for the team. There's a very heavy emphasis on communication and team coordination, which means playing this game with a microphone is an absolute requirement. If you plan on buying this game but don't plan on talking, then you probably shouldn't play it. Just to give you an idea of how important voice chat is, there's 3 different separate voice channels: proximity chat, squad chat, and command chat. Proximity chat is the one that allows you to yell at the guy next to you and tell him where the enemy is coming from, or asking a nearby support player for supplies, calling out a medic, and stuff like that. Squad chat is obviously a chat for the members of your squad, and command chat is for every squad leader and the commander. Alright, with that general overview of the actual gameplay, now let's go over some good things and some not so good things. The gunplay, the immersion, the graphics, and the experiences that you can have in this game are absolutely incredible. Rushing into a point after a bombing run has gone through is just incredibly cinematic and absolutely glorious. There's gonna be moments where you'll need to crawl carefully, inching over a dense forest where moving too quickly will get you a free headshot. There's also going to be moments where you go in guns blazing into a courtyard full of enemies and absolutely wreck everyone in sight. Few games have delivered the level of intensity and satisfaction from capping a point like Hell Let Loose has, because there's a constant need not only to outgun your enemy, but to actually win the tactical battle. The need to disrupt their spawn points and regain control of key areas of the map to be able to whittle down their defenses. When they mention the game is heavily inspired by Company of Heroes, it makes a lot of sense. In RTS games like Company of Heroes, you need to out-strategize your enemy, but also take into account the performance of individual squads as your units. More experienced squads will be able to win against a less experienced but better positioned enemy squad. All of this is true in Hell Let Loose, and it really does feel at times like you're playing a first-person RTS game. However, it's not all good. I was gonna talk about performance here because this game has had some performance issues from day one, but just yesterday we got a patch that massively improves performance across the board, and my frame rate has more than doubled in some maps, going from like 50 to 60 frames per second to 140 frames per second. So I think performance is no longer an issue. However, other issues persist. First off, there's no tutorial. Given how complex and how long it takes to learn everything you need to learn about this game, the lack of a tutorial is really a terrible thing. It means new players have absolutely no idea what is going on most of the time. This, combined with how important teamwork is in the game, playing with new players isn't an enjoyable experience. I wouldn't call the learning curve steep, it's just longer than in most games, I think. There's a lot you can ignore and still win and have great games. For example, you don't need to understand how to play Commander if you're going to be playing in a squad. However, knowing the Commander's abilities gives you a better insight into possible strategies that the enemy might use. A tutorial is long overdue. Even a simple explanatory video would be a huge improvement over having literally nothing. Well, not nothing, because there's this field manual which is basically a bunch of text detailing different things in a way that doesn't convey any sense of what's actually of importance. This is where the game is most lacking, and this comes from a guy that directly benefits from there being no tutorial. The other big negative aspect, at least for some people, is going to be the lack of historical accuracy. If you're playing Stalingrad, you'll see weapons like the STG-44 and vehicles like the IS tank. none were actually present in the Battle of Stalingrad since they were developed later in the war. And the list of historical inaccuracies doesn't end there. Cosmetics, meaning the uniforms and helmets that you use, are pretty accurate themselves, but they are not map specific, so there's nothing restricting players from using uniforms from units that weren't actually there in that map. Loadouts are also an issue. There's a bit too many Thompsons or MP40s around currently. Maybe that will change, because I can guarantee they will change the loadouts in the future when they add more weapons, but right now that's the way it is. Most players out there won't care about these issues, but I know some really will. I personally don't mind, so it's not an issue for me, though I do wish some vehicles were map restricted, like in games like Battlefield or Forgotten Hope. Other potential problems involve lack of polish in some areas of the game. Sometimes you'll be able to see enemies extremely far away, especially with a tank, but the render distance from some of the objects is lower than the render distance for enemies, meaning you might think they are out in the open when they are actually behind a fence or something that you're not seeing because it's not rendering. It's annoying, but it doesn't really detract from the game in any meaningful way, I think. There's also a few annoying bugs that crop out here and there, but I'm confident that those will get ironed out in future updates. So that's it, guys. I haven't really touched on some logistics and commander gameplay because, as I mentioned, there is a lot going in Hell Let Loose, and I didn't want to make the video too boring. If it isn't obvious by now, I absolutely recommend this game 100% to anyone that is looking for something more immersive and team-oriented than games like Battlefield, especially if you are playing shooters around the Counter-Strike Day of Defeat era, because there's definitely an old-school vibe to Hell Let Loose that I really appreciate. However, if you don't feel comfortable using voice chat, or if you're looking for a game you can quickly jump in and out of, then this probably isn't for you. Same goes if you're looking for a deeply realistic experience that strives for actual realistic combat. Hell Let Loose is in the middle of the road between those two experiences, and it fills that role extremely well. If you want to find out more about this game, maybe check out a few matches, then check out the links at the end of the video. I will include two playlists, one for guides and the other for matches and match commentary. Hopefully you will enjoy them and gain a bit more insight into what the game is actually like. Also, if you want to catch me live and ask me a bunch of questions about Hell Let Loose, then do so at twitch.tv/monoespacial_YT. You can find that link down in the video description. Alright, hopefully you guys enjoyed this, and if you did, then give it a like or think about subscribing to the channel for more. If you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them below, and as always, thank you for watching, and I hope I will catch you in the next one.